Hi, and welcome to this podcast produced by the Institute for European Environmental Policy. My name is Krystyna Springer, and I work as a policy analyst in IEEP's Land Use and Climate Programme. We are a non-profit organisation with 45 years of experience in advancing impact-driven sustainability policy across the EU and beyond. And since 2019, our network of think tanks called Think Sustainable Europe has been at the heart of our influence, shaping the environmental sustainability debate through its research and engagement with policymakers. The topic we have on our hands today is COP28, the United Nations Climate Change Conference, which took place in Dubai in December last year, and which marks the latest milestone in the global effort to address climate change and to put our societies on a path towards a sustainable future. And as we know, the conference was held against the backdrop of increasingly alarming scientific reports, which really underscore the urgency of immediate and decisive action to curb global temperature rise and protect the planet's ecosystems. Importantly, COP28 marked the culmination of the first global stocktake, which recognized that the global community continues to fall short in its efforts to limit global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And as the conference came to a close, in the wake of this evaluation, a final version of the stocktake text was adopted, calling for accelerated short-term action and an orderly transition away from fossil fuels. Parties also agreed to take action to reduce emissions by 43% by 2030 and to set the world on a pathway to reaching net zero emissions by 2050 in line with the best available science. So this COP agreement represents a significant shift, as it is now the first ever in 28 years of international climate negotiations to address fossil fuels and to put the alignment with science at the forefront of the fight against the climate crisis. And yet, words matter, and they also represent missed opportunities. To discuss this and more, I'm joined by experts from different corners of the globe. Please let me extend a warm welcome to Maria Jose Sanz and Gillian Bowser, who are here with us today. Maria Jose Sanz is the Scientific Director of the Basque Centre for Climate Change, BC3, which is an international and multidisciplinary research centre based in Spain that aims to contribute to long-term research on climate change, while at the same time emphasizing the importance of bridging scientific scales and languages to support policy and decision-making in an economically efficient and socially equitable way. And her research program focuses on how best to make land use decisions, allocating land resources in an optimal way for sustainable and efficient development. Before joining BC3, she worked for the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change in support of negotiations on land use change, forestry and agriculture, and REDD+ until 2011. Before 2007, she was the program manager for air pollution and atmospheric chemistry at the Center for Mediterranean Environmental Studies and an advisor to the Spanish Minister of the Environment. She was also the lead author of the fourth assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and was appointed member of the panel's Task Force Bureau on National Greenhouse Gas Inventories in July 2023. She holds a PhD in biology from the University of Valencia, and she has worked extensively on the feedback of air pollution and climate change in Mediterranean regions after her postdoctoral fellowship at Arizona State University. And our second guest is Gillian Bowser from Colorado State University. She focuses on ecological indicators of climate change, such as pollinator insects, and linkages between changing ecological conditions, local community livelihoods, and climate. She specializes in sustainability, citizen scientist engagement, and encouraging more students from underrepresented backgrounds to study science. And her current interdisciplinary work looks at biodiversity indicators at high elevations worldwide. Gillian has worked as a wildlife biologist and ecologist for the U.S. National Park Service in Yellowstone, Grand Tetons, Joshua Tree, and Wrangell St. Elias, and was a AAAS Science and Diplomacy Fellow in 2011. She serves on the board of the Rocky Mountains Sustainability and Science Network and participated in the UN Framework on Climate Change Convention and UN Global Environmental Outlook. It's great to have you both here, and we have a lot to cover, so let's dive in. So, Gillian, could you start us off by sharing some of your thoughts on the relevance of COP, both this one and previous conferences, for academies and universities, and how important it is for them to participate in the COP discussions?
The largest relevance of COP28, actually, I would say, started in COP26, and that was bringing in, for pretty much the first time, the role of nature and nature-based systems as part of the conversation around the Paris Agreement and the larger UNFCCC. So it's important to think back that the UNFCCC is mainly about emissions from where its origin is. So what we saw was this change of actually looking at processes in the environment. So this included nature-based solutions and mostly came out of the IPCC report that demonstrated nature's ability to remove carbon from the atmosphere far exceeded what people had thought in the past in terms of its ability to remove and store carbon. So this is a new framework and this is a new discussion. So the biggest outcome of COP28 was the completion of the Glasgow Work Program and the Sharm el-Sheikh programs that looked at how we could bring these ideas both into the discussions of climate, but more importantly, into the nationally determined contribution from each country, that they could bring that in as part of their strategies to address emissions. And this is a major difference on looking at how we could deal with the planet, but also deal with changing our emissions, but also saving nature at the same time, which is important for human well-being. So that, I think, was the most important. The second part of your question is on academics and universities. And I would add in that it's academics, universities, museums, and zoos. And the reason for that is when we look at nature and we talk about biodiversity loss, we need to know what we had to begin with. We need to know what that state and trend is to determine how to respond to it. So what is our policy response? The state and trend of most biological organisms, from invertebrates to soil to everything, is best measured in zoos and in museums because they have the historic records. And so for universities and academia, part of our job is to be able to pull that information together, help students and others and policymakers understand those trends. How do we know that biodiversity loss is occurring? It's by seeing what is missing in the environment or what might be declining. And all of that is based on all four institutions: academics, universities, museums, and zoos. Universities, all four of these institutions, are involved in, or should be more involved in, communicating science to the public and to policymakers. And so to understand scenarios and how we bring many different types of knowledge together, whether it's co-produced knowledge, whether it's indigenous or traditional knowledge, or what we call local knowledge, all of that informs us to changes in the environment. And that's our core goal here. What is changing in response to a climate that we've never experienced before?
Now, one of our key areas of focus is food and farming, and COP28 has been the first one to put these issues on the formal conference agenda, including by dedicating a full day to discussions around food system issues. And one of the pledges that came out of the COP28 was the UAE Declaration on Sustainable Agriculture, Resilient Food Systems and Climate Action, in which more than 150 countries committed to integrating food and farming into their nationally determined contributions by 2025. A few countries, including Brazil, Cambodia, Norway, Rwanda, and Sierra Leone, went further and created the Alliance of Champions for Food Systems Transformation, committing measurable targets by COP30 in 2025. We've also seen the FAO publish a new roadmap for countries to meet SDGs 2 and 13, so zero hunger and climate action, in a fair manner, although we should certainly note that it has faced criticism on a number of fronts, like, for example, the lack of reference to agroecology and the role of small farmers. Finally, the Loss and Damage Fund, intended to help poorer developing countries which suffer most from the consequences of climate change, is also important from a food system perspective, as agriculture is one of the most affected sectors. So, if nothing else, it does reflect a better understanding of food systems' role in global warming, and many experts have acknowledged these positive developments. Maria Jose, can I ask what your view is on these outcomes? Would you agree with this fairly positive assessment? Is it right for us to read these developments as a turning point, and a sort of reliable sign of a strong commitment to collective responsibility in delivering a food system transformation?
I agree on the positive assessment. I think, yes, for me it's positive, this turning point. But now the devil is in the details. And the point is how we're going to implement this systemic approach to the food systems, right? And that will require cooperation of different stakeholders in and out the governments and the multilateral agreement, which is the Climate Change Convention and its Paris Agreement. I think this COP can be considered the COP of the adaptation. It's the first COP with adaptation. It really took a lot of attention, and there were achievements that were not possible a few years ago. And one of them has been the adoption of the Loss and Damage Fund, which means that there is a recognition that there is already, populations and countries that lost because of the climate change, and this has to be compensated and supported, right? This is the first time that really we have a fundamental instrument for that. So in that regard, it was a great achievement, and in that regard, is a fundamental pillar of recognizing that impacts are there and adaptation is a must. So I think in that regard, it's good. But there are other things that happen there in adaptation. For example, the recognition that you have to really have instruments to measure the progress in adaptation. And the new 2 years program for metrics and indicators was also launched during the COP. And all the elements on adaptation were also quite well covered by the cover decision on the global stocktake, which I think it was also a very positive outcome. So I think that is clear that the countries are feeling more responsibility on delivering. I think it is clear that they want to include more systemic approaches in the way they implement the mitigation actions at the national level, and also to increase the interconnections through the global system on food, right? And that means also private sector, global commodity chains, trade, and so on. And that's extremely important. It doesn't mean that we are going to change the way the progress is reported under the convention. This will continue like it is. But the point is how you achieve the targets that you have on the sectors. And that for that, it requires a systemic approach. So you need to approach the system. And the system includes several sectors. That's the problem. Obviously, we can't compare systems and sectors. And this is a mistake that was made in the past. And I think we learned that this is not the way to go. But for acting, we really need to think in the systems and to see where in the systems we can make the best or more efficient interventions that will address the drivers of change and also minimize the trade-offs.
Gillian, as a biologist by trade, what are your feelings about this assessment? Is it more positive or negative? And do you see implementing sustainable food systems as a necessary precondition to limiting global biodiversity loss?
I see it more as positive because now food systems, agriculture, nature-based solutions, protected areas are all in the forefront of our discussion. I've attended the COP since COP15 in Copenhagen, and up until almost Glasgow, we seem to overlook the importance in the center actions of the Climate Change Convention, we overlook the importance of agricultural systems and what drives agricultural systems themselves. And so if we focus on fruit and nuts, for example, and maybe squash for North America and for most of Europe, all of these are pollinator dependent species. That means they depend on an insect pollinator for the production of fruit. And most of those insect pollinators are fairly unknown. The native bee population is fairly unknown across the world. So when we see its pesticides starting to impact pollinators, we see evidence of pollinator decline. This is a huge impact on food systems. So you have things like almonds, avocado, papaya, that are pollinator dependent, much less for North America. All of these have bee pollinators or other pollinators, insect-based pollinators that are susceptible to, impacted by pesticides and other issues. So I think that bringing these into the forefront is important because as we try and balance our food system, we need to think about what creates that food system, and which is often still, even in today's world, very dependent on natural systems, including pollinators, but also soil organisms that we tend to pay very little attention to. And soil organisms include many invasive species that have detrimental impacts that, again, we don't pay attention to. So to see these finally come forward when we talk about land use, land degradation, land use change, soil erosion, desertification, these are all interlinked with ecosystem services that are provided by small organisms like insects and other things.
And the final important development I would like us to touch on is the commitment of non-state actors to acting on food systems. So these included major private players who committed to source more sustainably produced commodities, as well as the pledges from a variety of foundations, such as the Bill and Melinda Gates and the Bezos Earth Foundation, which were promising more financial support for the transition to sustainable food systems. So this can be interpreted also as a shift towards more public-private partnerships and a greater involvement of the private sector in the food systems transformation at a global scale. So, Maria Jose, I wanted to ask, what, in your view, does this say about the governance of the global debate on food system transformation? What would be the role of science-oriented organizations such as IEEP and BC3 in supporting the private sector vis-a-vis the civil society and maintaining this momentum towards food system transformation into 2024, also in the EU?
For acting in the system, in the food system, we need to really look in which actors are the most prominent ones. And it's not only the public sector. We have actors that are acting at different scales, that they have different capacity of impact. They have different potential impacts on the measures that we'll take. There is a risk of distributional impacts to the low-income farmers, for example, or low-income business in the food chain, and we need to look at that very carefully. It's fundamental that the private business take a stake because they are the chain that connects the dots in the food system, from the production to the treatment of the waste, let's say. But we don't have a scheme or a framework to provide coherence to all these actions that the different actors are starting to think about or to move on. And that's a problem for me, because unless all this is done in a very, finely orchestrated manner, it is a risk of moving in different directions and creating, issues of distributional impacts, issues related to price of food, and so on and so on. And there are also strong connections with the energy cycle, for example. So we have to really be careful on that. And I believe that there is a need of an international way to coordinate all these efforts from public to private. There were signals in the global stocktake decision, in the cover decision, pointing to that. pointing that international cooperation is going to be fundamental. It is a general call, but I think it's particularly important for the food systems. Also because there have been already movements of some parts of the food production, for example, with palm oil commodity or with some other forest commodities, where we saw that the impacts were undesirable, for example, for the low income farmers in Indonesia, for example. So that is a call on attention that while doing so, we have to really be very careful, and a strong alignment and coordination of private sector and public policies is fundamental. And it's not only at the country level, it really has to come also at the international level. But we don't have a setting for that. That's the problem, right? We don't have a setting which is well recognized by all to do that. And I believe in the coming years, we will have to find ways to move in that direction and to have common spaces for coordination of public and private sector at different scales, from local to global. And this has to be reflected somehow in the way the long-term strategies are designed in the countries, as well as how you instrument your NDCs, 5-year cycles within the long-term strategy. And which led me to think that I think it will be needed to have much more stronger engagement of the private sector also at the national level. In particular, for those companies which have national representation, but also they are globalized. And they will be responsible for making sure that their contributions are consistent across countries and within countries. Otherwise, we are not going to go far. It's good that the organizations like FAO are looking into a roadmap. I guess what I think is important is that they also need to be realistic on what this means. Because sometimes when you think globally, you stylize too much the actions, and you lose the granularity of the context where the actions actually are going to implement. And at the end, you find that you didn't took into account some of the barriers that become obstacles for implementation. And for international cooperation, when you engage private sector, the issue is the credibility. How you build credibility on what the private sector is doing. And that, for mitigation on many sectors is been by trying to report and construct reporting systems. But on science-based targets, for example. So that leads me to think on what is the role of science here, no? For science-based institutions. I think we have to be there to point out these gaps in the first place, to say, we have this gap, so we need knowledge and science, but not only science, also knowledge from stakeholders in order to build trust in the first place and spaces for orchestrating, for coordination. And then the question of, do we put this in hardcore institutions or soft, or it comes to the plate? And I don't have an answer for that. But I believe that the science institutions, and particularly the scientific community, which is starting to be more connected with the stakeholders, it has a role to play to ensure that there is this sort of alignment and coordination. Maybe this is a soft manner to really remind them that they have to slightly change the way they're doing things. But then it has to be a trust relationship. So they have to trust the scientific community. We have to be more realistic on the ways and the piece of things can happen. And I tend to believe that the type of institutions that IEEP, BC3, and other partners of the Sustainable Europe network, they are starting, or they have already capacities that will be critical for that.
Gillian, just linking to what Maria Jose mentioned about the governance model, what would be the role of universities and academies in supporting the private sector in its approach to food system transformation, but also more generally with respect to sustainable policies and finance?
I think it's a partnership because in different countries, the intersections between private and federal or government is not so clear in the food systems. But it's important that And a small invertebrate does not see that difference. So we have to plan accordingly that things will move across private land and public land, as well as, across international borders with ease. So when you look at agricultural systems and we move food crops around the world, what do we take with them? And how do those things respond to a changing climate? So invasive species are probably our largest hidden impact on our food system and the security of our food system that, again, the climate debate has not paid attention to. So insects like warmer climates as a whole. Maybe the bumblebees might be an exception to that. So we move food crops around, we move pests with them, and we still move pests with them. And the pests move and respond very quickly. So we cannot talk about food security without looking at invasive pest species. All of those are increasing with warmer climates. They are doing very well. And this is an important point. When we talk about biodiversity loss, we tend to talk about vertebrate species. We're talking about mammals. We're talking about larger animals that we can measure. When we talk about smaller things, we have systematic data gaps. We don't know the number of species of beetles on this planet. So I think this is where we need to work more closely together to understand those systems and how they move and how they are responding to climate change. In a recent assessment, we highlighted that species change needs to be part of the conversation because invasive species, which includes native species changing their life cycles, is a huge issue that is underlooked as the climate shifts. As we lose our hard winters in the north, we find things like ticks are increasing rapidly. It's called a winter tick problem. We never had ticks in the winter. Now we have major ticks in the winter because they're moving and shifting. Mosquitoes are moving north, and they're moving north very effectively. So small things can move. They move by our transport systems. They move by our airplanes. They move by horticultural systems. And climate change allows them to adapt to new places that they may not have ever been able to survive in before.
That is so interesting. Thank you. And before we wrap up, just to finish on a positive note, I have a final question for you both. Could you summarize in just one or two words what, in your view, has been a major good outcome of the COP? Gillian, would you like to go first?
Sure. As I said, I think adaptation, global goals on adaptation in par with goals for mitigation is a big positive outcome of the COP. We need to adapt to a changing climate. We need to adapt at the speed of an insect, but we are not yet able to work at the speed of insects. And I think that's an exciting challenge because we have the technology and the tools to look harder, native plants, heritage plants, plants that were used in indigenous peoples and other things, and ask, why did these persist over the millennium? And maybe they are part of the solution to climate change. Diversifying our crops. It's one sort of core piece that is associated with changing climate conditions, as well as changing insect pests and insect pollinators that are all dependent on our food system. So our food system is also dependent on them, vice versa. So I think getting people to see that as an exciting adaptation strategy, but it's also one that's reachable. We can plant flowers in our gardens and help pollinators. We can change our food crops in our backyards and change the pollinators. So all of these can be local actions on biodiversity loss and change that does not require some crazy technology that we don't know yet how to create, much less how to get into the hands of school kids. Any school kid can plant a garden and save a pollinator. And I think that's the beauty of seeing that language in our global adaptation goals.
That is a really uplifting message. And Maria Jose, what are your words?
Well, I think we collectively, for the first time, decided that we need to phase out fossil fuels. And I think collectively we recognize that we need to support adaptation globally. And this has to be accompanied by investments and by financial support. And this is still something that we have to better articulate, but we are moving in that direction, slower than needed, but let's see.
This has been a great discussion. Unfortunately, this is all the time we have today. Many thanks to our speakers for sharing their thoughts and expertise with us. If you want to read more about the core policies linked to agriculture and land management, our work at IEEP, and our network, Think Sustainable Europe, check our website at IEEP.eu. And thank you very much to Maria Jose and Gillian for your insights, and thank you all for listening.